Thanks very much, Adam. I always remember Adam as being part of the golden years at Duke and helped make it go. And my thanks to Alan Richardson and his colleagues for the invitation. It's a genuine honor to be giving the Stephen Straker Lecture. It's a pleasure to be at UBC, and it's a special pleasure to be addressing such a congenial group. I've taken the occasion to put together some thoughts on current traffic between the humanities and the natural sciences. The topic has absorbed my attention for some time, and I've talked about it on other occasions. By the way, given the acoustical difficulties, if I begin to fade, somebody wave, and I'll amplify myself to the extent that I can, okay? So one of the occasions when I've talked about the topic before was at a Modern Languages Association forum on the future of the humanities in 2004. I spoke there of what I saw as significant new configurations of the two cultures with respect to each other. New connections and combinations, I noted, were already the focus of considerable energy, and more radical reconfigurations could be expected in the future, for better or for worse, I suggested. In the barely a decade since then, the energies of which I spoke are increasingly in evidence, and the new connections and combinations are now quite solidly established in many places. For example, last spring at Duke, within a single week, I attended a symposium on neuroeconomics at the university's humanities labs, heard a postdoc in English give a highly technical talk on brain imaging at our Center for Neurohumanities, and learned about a major new initiative at Duke aimed at redefining the role of the humanities in undergraduate education. The humanities labs, according to their description, are, quote, intended to replicate the knowledge production environment associated with the sciences, and the major new initiative, according to its description, quote, is generously funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation in recognition of the need for citizens and leaders to be able to obtain knowledge, to analyze it, and to think and act collaboratively in innovative ways to address growing interdisciplinary and global challenges, end quote. At the end of that same week, I attended a meeting of what turned out to be embattled humanities faculty, protesting, among other things, the requirement that as a condition for funding, new projects and events must involve faculty from the sciences and demonstrate cross-disciplinary connections. They actually said vertical integration, meaning it had to involve undergraduates too. That's actually what vertical integration meant for them. Developments of these kinds are what I'm calling here the new interdisciplinarity. That is, the growing interest of humanities scholars along with social scientists in neuroscience, increasing efforts by many of them to introduce concepts, methods, and findings from the biological and behavioral sciences into their home fields, programs intended to make scholarship operate, or at least look and sound more like scientific research, the growing prominence of hybrid fields such as neuroeconomics, neuroaesthetics, literary Darwinism, and cognitive cultural studies, projects seeking to integrate, in some sense, the humanities with the natural sciences, and the promotion of all these efforts, programs, and projects by university administrators and funding agencies. It's easy to be dismayed by some of these developments. The superficial science imitation, the vacuous corporate-style lingo, the obscure aims and dubious quality of much of the work issuing from the new hybrid fields, and the dyspeptic rhetoric of some of their most visible promoters. But the intellectual energy and adventurousness of the young scholars taking on these projects is often impressive. And one may suspect, as I do, that research of significant, perhaps even broadly transformative intellectual value will emerge from at least some of their pursuits. This mixed assessment is reflected in my title here: Integration, but also Disintegration, or the New Interdisciplinarity, for better and for worse. What I mean to do this afternoon is offer some general observations on these developments. I'll indicate some perennial difficulties faced by hybrid fields and say why I think the idea and ideal of pan-disciplinary integration should be rejected. Much of what I'll be saying applies to parallel efforts and projects in the social sciences, but my focus here will be on the humanities, with literary studies providing most of the examples. The engagement of humanities scholars with the sciences and with quantitative and empirical methods is, of course, by no means novel and extends to all fields. Art historians have long drawn on the psychology of visual perception in accounting for various iconographic styles and artistic techniques. Musicologists comparably have drawn on the psychophysics of sound. Many classicists are themselves archaeologists, and scholars of religion are often anthropologists. Literary historians have documented and calculated everything from the origins of book production to the changing distribution of reading publics, and the relevance of human evolution and cognitive psychology to the origin and effects of literary forms and genres has not been lost on literary theorists either. Indeed, some of the most scientifically well-informed, intellectually rigorous, and critically illuminating work now being produced in the humanities is altogether continuous with these early and ongoing efforts, duly updated and now extended and intensified. But some of the more dubious aims and efforts of the new interdisciplinarians have also been anticipated. One recalls, or some of us recall, the parade of new approaches in the 1960s and 70s that sought to apply terms, models, and methods from some then high-profile scientific field, such as information theory, structuralist anthropology, or transformational generative linguistics, to research in the humanities. In each case, the efforts were earnest and the applications technically informed. Blackboards filled with tree diagrams, much talk of signal-to-noise ratios in music, or of deep structures in the plots of fairy tales. But the results were minimally illuminating for all concerned, and in each case, the whole enterprise was more or less obsolete within a generation. What recalls these hapless projects are not efforts by scholars to engage scientific knowledge. Such efforts, as I just noted, have been ongoing for some time, generally to good effect and without fanfare. What recalls them is precisely the fanfare, the same striving for and claims of scientific method, scientific objectivity, and scientific progress, the same contrasts to the work of other scholars, both past and especially present, derided as aimless, subjective, and when it comes to real knowledge, small potatoes. Almost everyone agrees that the humanities are in trouble these days, but not everyone agrees on what those troubles are. Certainly, they include the changing economic and demographic structure of higher education and the cascading cultural effects of new media and other new technologies. Women and minorities, with their particular interests and perspectives, are especially visible in the humanities. Cultural transmission is more challenging with more heterogeneous populations. Admired practices and justified suspicions have become hyperbolic, with results ranging from the severely confining formalism of much analytic philosophy to extravaganzas of ideology critique in some quarters of cultural studies. Scholars' ignorance of relevant accounts in the biological and behavioral sciences hobbles their efforts in a number of areas. Glib dismissals of scientific perspectives are not uncommon in many fields. Some of the explicit anti-science sentiment in the humanities, including self-defining rejections of naturalism, reflects lingering theological associations and missions. Some of it reflects a single-minded sensitivity to a known history of damaging social biases validated by appeals to scientific authority. Nevertheless, what some observers see as signs of decline or essential weakness in the humanities could be justifiably claimed as important achievements or defining virtues, and a duly historically informed, non-tendentious story of how the present troubles unfolded has not yet, I think, been told. In the absence of such a story, a key question here is whether, as argued by some influential integrationists, a lack of scientificity as such is at their root, and conversely, whether current efforts to cure that supposed ill may not risk losing the ailing patient altogether. Many promoters of the new integrative project cite biologist E.O. Wilson's idea of consilience as inspirational. They operate accordingly with a view to the ultimate unification of all knowledge, commonly under the comprehensive rubric of science. Resistance to that idea and ideal is commonly attributed to one or another intellectual lack, bias, or offense on the part of the humanist critics. Sheer ignorance, a sentimental or theological view of human uniqueness, an obsolete mind-body dualism, or a postmodernist rejection of the very possibility of truth, knowledge, or science. Allusion to an obsolete mind-body dualism is especially frequent. Thus, literary Darwinist Joseph Carroll, defending a scenario for the integration of literary studies and all other humanities disciplines into a new megadiscipline that he calls the evolutionary human sciences, argues against objections from other humanities scholars that supposedly reflect such a dualism. Carroll writes, quote, "There are no real ontological or epistemological barriers separating the humanities and the evolutionary human sciences. It's the same world," he continues, "whether we're reading a novel, driving a car, or visiting the dentist. The same world, quote, intelligible by the same instruments," end quote. For Carroll, this means that literary scholars should be explaining why we read novels, and also why authors write them, and why fictional characters act the way they do, the same way that evolutionary psychologists explain everything else we do. That is, as manifestations of the operations of what are posited as underlying universal propensities and mechanisms presumed to have been adaptive in enhancing the reproductive fitness of our Stone Age ancestors. My concern here is not with the aims, claims, or methods of evolutionary psychology. I've examined them critically elsewhere. My concern is with the contention that an implicit mind-body dualism among humanities scholars is the major obstacle to making those aims, claims, and methods the foundation of literary studies and other humanities disciplines, and more generally, to realizing the ideal of pan-disciplinary integration or consilience. There is, of course, a long-standing theologically grounded insistence on the distinctness of the realms of the spiritual and the material, often allied with a corresponding epistemological dualism. That is, the idea that there are forms of knowledge, for example, revealed or intuited truths that are higher or deeper than the findings of science, or that there are phenomena such as consciousness or products of the human mind that cannot be explained in physical terms. But objections to the idea and ideal of consilience do not require any of those hoary dualisms or dubious ideas. Objections to the first, the idea of the unity of knowledge, can proceed from an adequate regard for intellectual history and its dynamics as documented and theorized over the past century by historians, sociologists, and philosophers of science. And objections to the second, the ideal of pan-disciplinary integration, can proceed from the altogether unsentimental, non-mystical observation that human beings can, and typically do, have multiple orientations toward the phenomenal world, and that these are reflected, among other places, in the distinctive aims and practices of the various academic disciplines. In his 1998 book, Consilience, The Unity of Knowledge, E.O. Wilson gives an account of Western intellectual history as a set of increasingly enlightened efforts moving since the 17th century toward harmony and unity, with significant disruptions from two major counter-Enlightenment forces, namely Romanticism and postmodernism. Some of Wilson's followers would disavow this historical romp, but they all accept the key idea of an intrinsically hierarchical organization of knowledge, a chain or ladder of what's described as decreasing explanatory scope and authority from the bottom up, with physics and chemistry seen as foundational to all other intellectual pursuits, and biology seen as foundational to both the humanities and the social sciences. In accord with this view, the ideal state of consilience would be achieved and the ancient Western project of enlightenment consummated if the humanities and social sciences, seen as carelessly scattered and willfully isolated, joined that progression toward harmony and unity, so that the integration of all knowledge, bottom to top, could be completed. Wilson writes, quote, "When we have unified enough certain knowledge, we will understand who we are and why we are here," end quote. The theological resonances are as evident here as anywhere else in contemporary thought. And Wilson, ex-Baptist as he describes himself, acknowledges them forthrightly. More significant, however, is the appeal made at every point in this naturalized millenarianism to views of knowledge that have been effectively challenged over the course of the past century by historians, sociologists, and philosophers of science. For example, a very different model of intellectual history, including the history of science, is suggested by Ludwig Fleck's classic study, Genesis and Development of a Scientific Fact, originally published in 1935. Drawing on his observations as a practicing scientist, he was a microbiologist and immunologist, we would say now, and medical historian, amateur medical historian. Fleck describes currently established scientific facts, for example, the identification of the causes of a particular disease, syphilis was his example, describes currently established scientific facts not as fixed features of an autonomous reality awaiting our discovery, but as products of a complex history of increasingly coordinated social, psychological, and material interactions. As he puts it at one point, facts emerge from a network in continuous fluctuation, end quote. In accord with such a model, we would see science and intellectual activity more broadly, not as a single chain or ladder anchored in physics, but as a dynamic field with multiple heterogeneous elements, assemblages of ideas, discourses, practices, and their products, sometimes contending, sometimes convergent, sometimes parallel, in which new elements merge in flex words, quote, with old ones to create stable points, which in turn are starting points for new lines everywhere, developing and again joining up with others, end quote. Not scattered or isolated, but multiple and heterogeneous. Not fixed in form or relationship, but forming and transforming, integrating and disintegrating endlessly, without completion or determined destination, but not without both local developments and significant, more or less stable and broadly appropriated achievements. There's much to be said, I think, for Fleck's view of science and for his model of the dynamics of intellectual history, though this is not the place to attempt it. I've attempted that elsewhere. 2 points, however, can be made here. One is that the tradition of science studies that follows from his work and from the work of those he influenced constitutes a strong alternative to the views of science and history that support E.O. Wilson's idea of consilience. The second point is that Fleck's related account of how scientific fields and disciplines operate suggests some of the difficulties faced by the new interdisciplinary ventures. Individual academic fields and disciplines, particle physics, microbiology, 18th century French literature, Lacanian film studies, and so forth, are prime examples of what Fleck called thought collectives. They are distinguished from one another not only by subject domain, that is, by what part of the phenomenal world they study, but also, and no less crucially, by implicit aims, systems of assumptions, discourses, and disciplinary cultures, what Fleck called thought styles. The awkwardness of the disciplinary newcomer, the art historian bumbling in the laboratory of the neuroscientist, or the neuroscientist bumbling in the gallery of the art historian, is like that of any other cultural immigrant. Becoming acculturated as a neuroscientist or art historian is not just a matter of mastering a set of canonical ideas, texts, images, or techniques. It's also a matter of knowing a set of tacit but crucial norms. What counts as a well-designed experiment, a useful model, a rigorous analysis, or a subtle interpretation. It's a matter of knowing what matters, the currently important issues in the field, the significant rival views, which connections are interesting and which irrelevant. It's having a fund of informal know-how acquired through a personal history of active practice as precisely an active practitioner. The existence of highly particular disciplinary cultures creates difficulties for any interdisciplinary venture, even when the conjunction involves closely related but historically distinct fields, such as evolutionary and developmental biology, now joined, not without difficulty, in the field of evo-devo. The difficulties increase, of course, as the fields involved are more diverse, and there are some that are specific to ventures seeking to merge the humanities with the natural sciences. One set of difficulties arises from what Sheila Jasanoff, in a related context, she's talking about interdisciplinarity, particularly for STS, what she calls the power differential. I'm content to call it the prestige differential, but without denying its implications for institutional and, as a matter of fact, personal politics. At their best, engagements between humanists and scientists in hybrid fields would work well in both directions. For example, collaborative research in a field like neuroaesthetics would sharpen, inform, and enrich ongoing studies and teaching in art history, and it would extend the scope and refine the formulations and techniques of neurophysiology. That's the hope and promise of the new interdisciplinarity, that it is, or will be, as it's said, a two-way street. And it sometimes does happen that way. But the prestige differential between the humanities and the natural sciences is very steep. And the forces sustaining it are deeply entrenched both in the culture of the academy, where it mirrors exactly Wilson's hierarchy of disciplines with bottom and top reversed, and in the broader culture as well, as reflected in familiar contrasts between serious work and mere play, real things and mere words, hard and soft disciplines, and of course hard and soft people. The prestige differential is significant here because it creates or exacerbates a number of perennial problems in two culture crossing projects. One is the tendency of humanities scholars to regard the scientific materials they import altogether uncritically, even when, as is largely the case in the new hybrid fields, those materials, findings, concepts, and methods are still being developed and still controversial in their own fields. In STS terms, they tend to black box scientific ideas and technologies prematurely. There's a second related problem. Even though scholars may become very knowledgeable about concepts, findings, and methods in fields like evolutionary biology or cognitive neuroscience, they are generally not equipped to assess experimental designs, statistical analyses, or the robustness of conclusions in those fields. These evaluative skills come with training, acculturation, and experience in the fields themselves, and include knowledge of the details of currently challenging views or important rival approaches. Because the importing humanities scholars are at a disadvantage in these respects, they often put their money on transient views and approaches. For example, assumptions and methods central to evolutionary psychology have been seriously challenged virtually from the beginning in the relevant scientific fields, including genetics and developmental psychology. And a number of concepts central to work in cognitive approaches in the humanities, from the significance of mirror neurons for human behavior to the existence of a specific theory of mind capacity, are undergoing extensive modification. Human cognition has become an exceptionally active area of investigation, with fundamentally different models and methods being developed by researchers and theorists working in a range of fields. For example, as distinct from, we'll call it the computational modular model followed in mainstream cognitive science and evolutionary psychology, cognitive processes can be viewed in an ecological framework developed by, among others, biological systems theorists, developmental psychologists, neuroscientists, and philosophers of mind. Viewed in such a framework, human cognition is understood as the full range of activities through which, as embodied creatures, we interact with our more or less continuously changing physical, cultural, and social environments, thereby ourselves changing more or less continuously. Investigation pursued in such a framework does not identify cognitive processes with mental as distinct from bodily activities. There's certainly no mind-body dualism here. Nor does it seek to locate cognitive processes in some especially interior place, either the mind or the brain, as distinct from the total embodied, active, and interactive organism. Also, although various cognitive tendencies and capacities are seen as emerging more or less reliably in all humans, they are not seen as necessarily innate in the sense either of genetically specified or inevitably present at birth. Nor are such species-wide capacities, for example, the ability to use language or to infer other people's psychological states from their overt behavior, such capacities are not taken as evidence for the existence of highly specific, discrete, innate mental structures, such as a language acquisition device or a theory of mind module. Nor finally, although it's presumed that the neural structures involved in such capacities have evolutionary histories, neither the structures nor the capacities are seen as fixed, largely in the forms they had in the brains and behavioral responses of our Stone Age ancestors living under Stone Age conditions. This is not the place to argue the merits of such an alternative model of human cognition. What's important here is simply the fact that such alternatives exist, which means, and they are quite respectable, which means, among other things, that neither the computational modular model of mind nor the related idea of highly specific innate cognitive mechanisms is an established fact of contemporary cognitive science or of any other science. The processes and mechanisms currently invoked in cognitive evolutionary studies of art, literature, and religion are not facts shown by research or known to scientists. They are a controversial set of ideas in a rapidly developing field of heterogeneous studies. As I noted earlier, one need not be an ontological dualist in order to question the idea of consilience or the ideal of the ultimate unification of all knowledge. One may agree that anything and everything in the world is available for scientific exploration and open to naturalistic explanation, that there are not two fundamentally different realms of being, mind and matter, or physical nature and humanity. But one may still observe that there are multiple fundamentally different ways in which humans orient themselves toward the world, and that those different modes of orientation and related modes of engagement are reflected in the distinctive aims and operations of the various disciplines. One of the ways we engage the world is by seeking to extend and strengthen our control over the physical conditions of our existence. Accordingly, we seek to chart, model, and explain those conditions conceptually and to modify them or intervene in them in their operations technically. But we also seek to develop and manifest ourselves as experiencing creatures, And accordingly, we are engaged by the experiences, creations, and reflections of our fellow humans. These two are not the only ways we orient ourselves toward the world or engage with it. The list could be extended, and I'll mention other modes in a moment. But they are clearly distinct, and they suggest the different epistemic aims and practices that in the West have become specialized, or roughly specialized, as the natural sciences and the humanities. Human actions and social actions can certainly be viewed as natural phenomena and related to the behavior of other animals, or, as Wilson does, to the behavior of insects. Paintings, poems, and philosophical essays can certainly be compared to the material products and bodily displays of other creatures, such as spider webs or peacock's tails. And both human actions and their various products can be investigated and explained in terms of the general properties of material objects and general physical and chemical processes. No question. It nevertheless remains the case that investigating and explaining human actions and products in such terms, whatever rewards and illuminations they provide, and they do, are not the only ways to engage them cognitively. As we, or some of us, have come to recognize, the specificity of the modern sciences does not lie in a unique ability to deliver assured knowledge. It lies rather in what has evolved historically as a set of conceptual and methodological commitments attached to aims that are both pragmatic and intellectual. The commitments in question, notably naturalism, empiricism, and experimentalism, and the types of practice they entail, constitute an extremely efficient apparatus for generating models of the operations of the physical world that enable us to predict, control, and intervene in those operations with maximal effectiveness and reliability. To the extent that any human project has those sorts of aims, the apparatus of modern science is probably the most consistently effective means for achieving them. But those are not the only aims that human beings have. Scientific models also, but less centrally, respond to our desire for intellectually satisfying accounts of the phenomenal world. They are less central in this regard because experiences of intellectual satisfaction are far more variable than observations of pragmatic effectiveness. All may agree that a bridge has been built or a sick baby cured, almost all, but the account of some complex set of humanly significant phenomena, art, love, religion, that satisfies one person may strike another as superficial and a third as irrelevant. For these reasons, among others, the effectiveness of scientific models in serving pragmatic aims, they work, does not make them either the only kinds of accounts we value or the only kinds of genuine knowledge to be had. Claims of monopoly intellectual status for the products of the natural sciences overlook many other altogether genuine, reliable, authentic forms and types of knowledge. These include formally and informally transmitted bodily skills, material techniques, cultural practices, family histories, tribal lore, official chronicles, biographies, memoirs, philosophical meditations, learned reports and analyses, documentary images and their interpretations, and so forth. These are all forms and types of knowledge of the world, particularly the world of human activity, experience, and achievement, that are no less necessary for our survival as the kinds of creatures we are than the models and theories that yield sturdy bridges, and life-saving medicines. Our cognitive orientation toward the world, even if we are dedicated scientists, is not only or always investigative or interventionist. It is sometimes, and perhaps always to some extent, aesthetic or reflective. Aesthetic and reflective engagements do not produce what we call scientific knowledge, but they do have significant cognitive effects, and so do disciplinary practices, artistic, scholarly, and pedagogic, that elicit, enable, and shape such engagements. The effects are not as palpable, immediate, readily describable, or pragmatically translatable as the products of investigative engagements, but they are personally and communally valuable, perhaps in some ways crucial. To the extent that the artistic, scholarly, and pedagogic practices of the humanities disciplines, classics, literary studies, music, visual studies, philosophy, elicit, enable, and shape such engagements, aesthetic and reflective, they too are, for that very reason, both personally and communally valuable, perhaps in some ways crucial, necessary for our survival as the kinds of creatures that human beings are. To the extent that any human project aims at generating pragmatically reliable models of the operations of the physical world, the practices of modern science are probably the most effective means for achieving them. But those are not the only aims that human projects have, either individually or communally. And historically, serving those aims is not what scholarship and teaching in the humanities have been communally valued for doing. These differences of cognitive orientation and communal function do not mark lacks to be supplied, gaps to be closed, or stubborn refusals to be deplored. They mark different places to be maintained, cultivated, and inhabited. These institutionalized places, what we call the sciences and the humanities, adjoin at many points, and intellectual traffic between them is, I think, to the good of all concerned. But that's not the same as seeking to integrate them. I've mentioned teaching along with scholarship in connection with the distinctive aims and social functions of the humanities. It's important to recognize that much of what happens in the humanities happens in classrooms, and that scholarship itself is geared most directly to pedagogy. Indeed, pedagogy is the major technical application of humanities research, and the effects of such pedagogy on people, especially, but not only young people, are their major technological products. It's for this reason that new angles and approaches are continuously developed and deployed in fields like literary studies. The continuous succession is not a sign of aimlessness or futility. It's a reflection of the need for pedagogic effectiveness, here and now, in relation to the interests and conditions of succeeding generations. That's also why the characteristic subjectivity of interpretive practices in the humanities is not a flaw or limit to those practices, but an essential source of their value. Exploring and seeking to convey human experience is fundamentally different from observing, describing, and seeking to explain human behavior. Again, exploring and seeking to convey experience is fundamentally different from observing and seeking to explain behavior. The humanities are, in that respect, definitively subjectivist rather than objectivist. They are also definitively partisan rather than impartial. A formal, institutional locus of concern for humans, not as one species among others, but as species kin and fellow mortals. The humanities are not, or no longer, a locus of pastoral solicitude for humans as unique beings with transcendent destinies. But they are also not a locus of investigative interest in the behavior or physiology of humans as hominids, primates, or mammals. The Humanities Academy, we are generally happy to say, is not a church. I don't think we would be happier to see it become another laboratory. Many of the differences and difficulties I've outlined here have been noted by others, including scholars and scientists who themselves work in hybrid fields. For example, Anjan Chatterjee, a neuroscientist at the University of Pennsylvania, who also conducts research in neuroaesthetics, raises a number of crucial questions in his recent overview of the latter field. Writing of the challenges faced by its efforts to bring neuroscience into the field of aesthetics, he asks, quote, "When does neuroscience provide deeper descriptive texture to our knowledge of aesthetics, and when does it deliver added explanatory force? Knowing that the pleasure of viewing a beautiful painting is correlated with activity within the orbitofrontal cortex adds biological texture to our understanding of the rewards of aesthetic experiences. However, it is not obvious that it advances our understanding of the psychological nature of that reward. For neuroscience to make important contributions to aesthetics, the possibility of an inner psychophysics has to be taken seriously," end quote. That was Anjan Chatterjee. Chatterjee's distinctions here are precise and urbane. A correlation between a subject's report of pleasure in viewing a painting, I should say, while lying on his back in a machine that's going around. Chatterjee also talks about the methodological limits, but I won't go into that here. So a correlation between a subject's report, so he hits a button saying, yes, good, or 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. A correlation between a subject's report of pleasure in viewing a painting and an image of activity in some area of the subject's brain, it lights up, doesn't explain the pleasure. Rather, Mrs. Chatterjee, it adds biological texture to our understanding of that kind of experience. It's a nice turn of phrase, I think, that reflects both the genuine contribution of a certain type of scientific knowledge to a classically humanistic enterprise, but also its limits. Connecting the observation of neuronal activity to the reported experience of aesthetic pleasure, or in Chatterjee's terms, to an inner psychophysics, is not, in my view, a mind-body problem, but it is a hard problem. It's partly a conceptual problem, a matter of negotiating between third-person and first-person perspective. That is a very hard problem. It's also a rhetorical problem, a matter of finding some way to articulate, to join together, two verbal idioms that have evolved historically to serve radically different ends. On the one hand, the observational, impersonal idiom of the natural sciences that strives to be informative and appropriately precise. On the other hand, the phenomenological, experiential idiom of the humanities that strives to be evocative and appropriately subtle. It's not an impossible task, but it requires a kind of intellectual and linguistic tact, the cultivation of which is one of the major challenges faced by the new interdisciplinarity. I don't think consilience-minded programs will succeed in integrating the humanities with the natural sciences. But I do think the new hybrid approaches in the humanities, neuroaesthetics, cognitive evolutionary approaches to literary and cultural studies, and so forth, have a good chance of surviving and prospering. As I've said before, they're attracting many talented, energetic, and broadly informed young people to their pursuit. I gave a paper on a comparable topic at a graduate student conference on the humanities and scientific method, and was really very, very impressed by, nobody's heard of them. They're still getting their degrees, but they know quite a bit, and they're doing interesting things, and they're smart. There's also a good deal of institutional interest already invested in them. Most significantly, practitioners of these approaches are beginning to respond positively rather than with defensive hostility to external criticism, and also beginning to practice discriminating internal criticism rather than indiscriminate mutual citing and puffing, as is in the past. All of the new directions are signs of self-confidence and a sense of achieved academic respectability. I think that as increasingly chastened, mellowed, and sophisticated products of the new approaches appear in journals, conferences, and classrooms, they are likely to join other activities in the Humanities Academy, both old and new, both disciplinary and interdisciplinary. The new approaches would be enriched, I think, if practitioners moved about a bit more in their libraries, virtual libraries, of course, or even just down their corridors. For example, more attention to recorded as distinct from unrecorded human history would be a desirable corrective to the peculiar ahistoricism of much evolutionary psychological theorizing, which tends to fly directly from the Upper Paleolithic to the present without hitting any of the ground in between. Practitioners might also take serious note of a number of other intellectual developments directly relevant to their projects. This would include what I described earlier as ecological conceptions of human cognition, important works such as Action in Perception by cognitive theorist and philosopher Alva Noe, which argues that our knowledge of the world is gained through active embodied exploration rather than through a strictly above-the-neck processing of external inputs. Or Cognition in the Wild by cognitive anthropologist Ed Hutchins, which describes the cognitive coordination of multiple forms of social and technical information involved in collaborative activities like navigation. The book is about bringing a ship into port, and he talks about all the different forms of knowledge that are involved and coordinated by the individuals and the groups for that to occur. It's by no means all in one person's head, and it's certainly not all above the neck. Or another book, Beyond the Brain, How Body and Environment Shape Animal and Human Minds by Canadian biological anthropologist Louise Barrett, which offers, among other things, it's a wonderful book, extensively informed correctives to easy analogies between animal and human behaviors. Other directly relevant intellectual developments include the revisionary accounts of knowledge and science elaborated over the past 30 years or so by, as you all know, historians, sociologists, and philosophers of science in the tradition of Ludwig Fleck, and in short, STS. The work of figures such as David Bloor or Bruno Latour, which is to say, the accounts of knowledge and science denounced and dismissed by their mentors as extreme epistemological skepticism or postmodern nihilism. Finally, practitioners of the new approaches might take note of ongoing work by fellow humanities scholars that engages scientific knowledge centrally, profoundly, and precisely, but makes no claim to scientific status itself and has no pan-integrationist aims. Studies such as Stephen Meyer's Irresistible Dictation, which examines Gertrude Stein's experiments in writing as reflections of her immersion in early 20th century scientific thought, or John Protivi's Political Affect, Connecting the Somatic and the Social, which engages ecological accounts of embodied cognition along with currents in continental philosophy to lay out new directions for political theory and practice. The work of these and other such scholars, otherwise quite diverse, is marked by the rigor, subtlety, and sophistication of their engagement with all the fields, all the texts, and all the topics they consider, whether techno-scientific, literary, cultural, or philosophical, and by the genuine illumination they provide of the historical, interpretive, and theoretical questions that they consider. Given the likely increase of two-culture crossing ventures and the participation of scientists in many of them, one may hope for a time when the sour after effects of the science wars fade away. Awareness of the distinctive aims, operations, and achievements of the humanities may replace these after effects, along with acknowledgement of the existence, value, and rigor of historical knowledge, textual knowledge, and iconographic knowledge. We may look forward to an academy in which the virtues of subtlety as well as clarity are appreciated by scientists and vice versa by humanists, and in which solitary scholarship as well as collaborative research is appreciated by funding agencies and upper administrators. A final word. As I suggested earlier, academic disciplines can be seen as relatively stable assemblages of continuously emerging, developing, combining, and differentiating intellectual traditions and practices, or as continuously both integrating and disintegrating. What we speak of now as the natural sciences and the humanities are unlikely to retain their current forms or even identities or labels in the future. On the contrary, we are witnessing radical transformations of both in our lifetimes as education in the humanities as elsewhere becomes increasingly highly mediated, and as the sciences become increasingly integrated precisely with industrial and commercial ventures. These developments, like the new interdisciplinarity, can be for better as well as for worse. But one can certainly be concerned over the prospect of losing practices that have, in all senses, untranslatable value. These include the sorts of open-ended explorations or so-called blue sky science that were fostered in the academy but have diminished ground in industrial and commercial ventures. And in the humanities, they include the sorts of intense in vivo practices of cultural transmission that risk being crowded out by more spectacular pedagogic technologies. Voicing joint concern over these comparable threats and losses won't unify the humanities with the sciences, but it would bring scholars and scientists together in a good cause. Thank you.
We have about 20 minutes for discussion. Questions, answers.
I have to tell you, I'm hard of hearing. The amplifiers work, but I have to see your mouth, and you have to stand up and speak rather slowly and clearly. And it would help because, as I've been suggesting, where the question comes from matters. So if you tell me, even just briefly, what your field is or what your angle is, it would help.
Mark Vesey.
Great column. My flag of convenience is the English department, where I navigate huge ships with colleagues here in all sorts of complex embodied ways. I also have a job on the side as principal of a college which was founded 20 years ago to encourage interdisciplinary collaboration, but certainly not in the cause of pan-integrative projects of the kind that you have so effectively critiqued. Quite to the contrary, in fact. But my question is really a very small one. I grew more and more curious about your sense of the identity of the humanities. You spoke at one point of two cultures, and you spoke repeatedly of natural science on the one hand and the humanities on the other. And at one point, unless I missed something, you listed off the humanities in a very short list.
Oh, it was not exhaustive. It should have, if I didn't put in the and so forth, I should have.
Well, what I noticed was that if you were, on the list you offered us, it didn't have to include any social science at all.
No.
Right. And that does seem to me a critical issue. I mean, the mapping of the disciplines at this university gives us a faculty of arts comprising humanities, social sciences, and a number of professional programs in the same general vicinity. But what intrigued me about your, not exhaustive, but nonetheless somewhat exclusive definition of the humanities was how quickly it closed in on certain kinds of aesthetic experience, be it in art history, in literatures, classics, whatever that may be, because after all, classics is only really literatures again, if it's not social science of the archaeological and historical kind. And quite where the history fits in here wasn't clear to me at all, though you did emphasize historical experience along the way. So I'm just curious, actually, to get a little closer to your core sense of the humanities. If that's a category that's worth preserving, and you suggest that it...
A few things to say. First, you might not have caught it, but I did say at the beginning that many of my observations about the relation of the humanities and the natural sciences had parallels in the relation of the social sciences to the natural sciences, all right? But that I was going to be focusing on the humanities, and I used the term two cultures. I've written at some length about that very term and the fact that the social sciences get shortchanged, to put it mildly, in Snow's account. So I'm not going to give what I offer as a core sense of the humanities is, as I say, dealing with conveying, enabling, eliciting experiences, aesthetic, reflective, comparative, discursive. I did not list each discipline each time, but I did try to cover, I believe, all of them. If I slighted any, I also said at the beginning that I would focus on literary studies. It's my field, and I know it best. But I think that's about, the whole paper was trying to get at some sense of how one can understand the humanities discipline, both as they have developed historically. I mean, we're talking about, a certain number of hundreds of years. This is not a Platonic thing. I mean, German philosophers can sort out the field of knowledge as if it was a Platonic field, and upper administrators can try to do the same thing sometimes. But the fact is that disciplines and clusters of disciplines are historical combinations, so that there's no way in which to give an essence of the humanities. What I've tried to do is say, as they've evolved, they seem to involve, to relate to our orientation toward the world as experiencing creatures rather than as observing, explaining creatures. That was the, I think, what I said a few times. So, and as far as the social sciences are concerned, it's very interesting, but the social sciences tend to repeat these differences within themselves. That is, you get sort of a fractal effect, as has been noted by Andrew Abbott, a very interesting historian of the disciplines, sociologist, intellectual sociologist, so that you get within anthropology, the well-known division between biological and cultural anthropology, in psychology between clinical and experimental, in sociology, you could say between number crunching and more theoretical. Some people talk about the soft social sciences or the interpretive social sciences, but the effort is a recognition that the social sciences, which are somewhat latecomers, in a sense they're really about 100 years old, right, and they repeat within themselves the same dynamics, the same forces that you see played out across the entire disciplinary field.
Thank you very much for a really stimulating talk. And I wanted to ask you a question that's sort of a, what do you think about this kind of a question? So another area in which I've seen a lot of attention to the potential productivity of cross-disciplinary collaborations between the arts and the sciences, or the humanities and the sciences, has to do with more explicitly artistic and scientific collaborations that are not usually framed in terms of common overlapping intellectual interests, but rather the kinds of productive areas of humanistic inquiry, scientific inquiry, and projects that can come out of overlapping spaces of work. So people, I'm thinking of people like David Edwards, I think his name is, that are creating these, we're trying to advocate that more of this productive conversation will come out of more physical spaces that are hybrid laboratories/galleries that would facilitate a kind of, so you just can kind of conceive of
all I can say is, yeah, this is simply, I mean, it's a very good, it illustrates part of what I'm saying, which is that there are many places and spaces where activities and assemblages of different kinds occur. I mean, the notion that hierarchical notion of the chain or the ladder of disciplines simply does not describe what you find just turning your head around. And I know some of the work that has been done. It's tremendously interesting. Often has a political edge to it, which is so it's a shared critical relationship also. And I've seen these things exhibited. They're fascinating. But you're right. It's a different point of coming together that is not. It does not fit the description of consilience or disciplinary integration, and it's not primarily, I guess. The thing is that, what does cognitive mean anymore? Okay? I'm perfectly happy with, the sort of definition that was given maybe as long ago as 40 years ago by Maturana. Cognition is life. Cognition is the activity of the organism interacting with its environment and being modified by it. That's cognition. Cognition is coextensive with living, and living is coextensive with doing. So knowing, living, doing. These are. So it is very hard for me to say it's not cognitive, it's not intellectual, it's not epistemic, because it's not clear to me that there is a particular way in which we are set up to be intellectual as opposed to some other way of operating.
Stephen.
My name is Stephen Talnick. I'm in German at UBC. And I wanted to say how much I appreciated your remarks, especially the critique of this conciliatory movement coming from E.O. Wilson. Still, I found what you said, until the very end, I found it extraordinarily peaceful, I should say, and even harmonious in some regards. But then in the end, you signaled two of our worst problems, namely, what did you call them? Administrators and funding agencies, right? And they point already to, that notice points to a serious asymmetry in the traffic you're investigating, and that occurs throughout your talk. For example, the marvelous description of the humanities labs where people are supposed to replicate what science does, in the humanities. In other words, the traffic you're describing is at the least very one-sided, when you say, quite one-directional, especially in terms of funding and administrative opportunities. And so, while I appreciated what you said about what the humanities offer, it sounded rather precious rather than productive. It sounded rather private rather than public. And so I'm interested in hearing from you perhaps a little more robust account.
No, I'm sure we're on the same side of many of these issues, but I resist wanting to make, if you don't like the description of the replicating laboratories, the word replicate in that place is just precious. If anything is precious, exactly. Is the word replicate in that particular description. I don't want to make a case for the humanities, how much they lead to increased employment, okay? A lot of that case is being made. In fact, it's the official case that has now been made by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in a very corporate, heavy account of called The Heart of the Matter, which you may have run into. So no, I do not want to make the case that way. I want to make the case, if you like, as extreme as possible. That is, I want to say that which the humanities does, which is least translatable into hard coin, without denying, however, the crucial significance for cognitively, which is to say, for living, for being, for doing.
But does that not have the effect of making it most easily dismissed?
I hope not.
All right, I see 3 hands. We have officially 7 minutes. We might go a little bit over if you have to leave. If you have to leave, we don't have to leave. Fred has been trying to say something. Fred Stockholder.
My name is Fred Stockholder. I taught here in the Arts 1 program and in the English department. You'll have to excuse my awkwardness. I have a bit of arthritic knee.
Understood.
Your paper was very civil, the kind of exercise in civility, and I don't want to criticize that. But I do want to ask you questions that come from more combative areas. And we have here two programs, and many others as well, but there's a Science 1 and there's an Arts 1. And the function of Science 1 is clearly one thing very important, making better scientists. The function of Arts 1 is not to make better artists, or it's a kind of program of essentially built on citizenship, how to be a citizen, and it includes what we call not interdisciplinary but self-disciplinary programs in the first-year program. And the intention of that citizenship, as different from perfecting a discipline, is very clear. And just one other place which might throw some light on it. My daughter worked at Yale for a while, and she had a dean of science come to dinner. And I talked to him about Article and its objective being citizenship. And I said, what would be your major objective? And he said, leadership.
To face the global challenges.
And so the problem, I think, is the object of science, as you quite properly showed, was a kind of technical contribution to society. I would think not intellectual at all. That it's framework by and large.
I wouldn't agree to that. I think let me pick up on something that you've said, and it's only so many paragraphs within. What you describe as Science 1 is, I think, a problem. The fact that the introductory course for science is directed not only at making scientists, but at weeding out those who won't be, so that there is no proper pedagogy in science for non-science majors. It's been an ongoing mission of mine, I mean, really for 50 years. It's very, very hard to get scientists to understand why it is that it's important to have a kind of course which is not a watered-down course for fluffy-headed people that would make current knowledge in science available to very able, skilled, directly interested people who are not themselves scientists. A great deal of the objection to the ignorance of people of science by people in the humanities can be attributed directly to the fact that there is, as they are now beginning to realize, scientists, they have done a quite bad job at educating the general population as opposed to feeding the STEM pipeline, as they usually put it. So that is another part of the story that hasn't been told of how these various troubles have unfolded. And for me, that's a crucial element in the story.
Sorry. I hate to cut you off, but there were two last hands I saw, and these will be the two last questions. For Alexei and Alan.
Right, I'll try to be fast. Admittedly, there are muddy fields that try to claim they're scientific, and at the same time trying to make something realistic or reductionist claims over some other fields. My problem about them is whether we should consider them more dangerous or more laughable, and therefore whether the proper strategy of dealing with them is either rising to alarm or making fun. And in certain sense, because you mentioned at the beginning of your talk that there had been early made sort of some extravagant claims to unify incompatible disciplines across, like say 50 years ago, cybernetics and other things. And these attempts produced some good scholarship and also lots of bad scholarship. They did not destroy disciplines. We may say they created new disciplines, say computer science, something like that. But what they did not do, they did not destroy existing disciplines, because the existing disciplines are not only flexible, flex thought collectives, they're also very robust, thoughtless, and almost immovable structure for university with bureaucracy and funding and things. And this is, I think, what sort of what almost guarantees that no fashionable book by whatever Wilson or somebody else, no matter how many copies it sells, I think it's almost powerless to change the bureaucratic structure.
Yes, I totally agree.
And we will give Adam the last.
Adam Frank from English. Just two things that jumped out at me that I really appreciated in your talk were pointing to the question of awareness of different aims for, broadly speaking, the sciences and humanities, but also possibly a more differentiated set of aims. And then also this question of tact. And then kind of you return several times to questions of subtlety and questions of tact. And I think those are related, because what is tact except something like an unspoken awareness that different people in the group might have different aims and are coming from different places. And I guess my question is, how do you cultivate tact What might the sources of
Ask this question.
be? And I think this is partly a response to previous problems with your stability. I guess, how do you go about
Well, I mean, you know what the answer to that is, and that is that can't be taught directly. It's sort of like creative writing, all right? In other words, people, you can encourage it, you can identify it, you can punish it if it's not, you can slap somebody's wrist if they're being tactless or crude. But no, what I think it will emerge from the sophistication of the practices, from the maturing of the field, from the existence of exemplars, the way it happens in fields. If it happens at all, I'm not sure it will happen, but that would certainly be the hope, yes.
Well, it's no doubt extremely appropriate that we end this year's Straker lecture discussing sophistication and tact. So, for a sophisticated and tactful lecture, let us thank Barbara Herrnstein Smith.